Hi everybody. Well, Susie and I are back with you. Today we're going to be talking about the Oz factor, which is a very strange phenomenon that often occurs in close encounter experiences. So Susie, tell us where that term came from and a little bit of the history.
Well, the term was coined by the British UFO researcher Jenny Randles in her book UFO Reality, published in 1983. And in her research, she had discovered that a lot of people described some rather paranormal circumstances surrounding their contact experiences or close proximity to craft. And so she decided to use this terminology. Of course, it originates from the wonderful Wizard of Oz storybook, where Dorothy goes into an alternate dimension. And so the parallel here is that we're dealing with something where people their consciousness or whatever may go into some other kind of altered state, other dimensional reality, or some paranormal status which is reflected physically, emotionally, mentally, and is associated with sound and a whole lot of other characteristics that we can go in as we progress through our talk today.
So it's like people are either put into a bubble of alternate reality, I guess, and which is a particular zone of area where those things happen, where time can slow down, or it can go backwards or forwards, or time can be frozen. And during the 90s, I had many reports actually, of people having close encounters where they would be what they thought was inside this bubble, where the air would be still, but on the outside, you know, that they could see the trees blowing, particularly if there was storms and if it was rain, and they wouldn't feel any of that. And they wouldn't even hear any of it. They would, but they could see it outside this non-physical zone.
That's right, and I think that if we go right back to the 70s, where we had a lot of the abduction and contact instances being actually publicised for the first time, or in numbers for the first time, I think there was a lot of misunderstanding around that. And I know at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, in paranormal research and psychical research, psychologists believed that this kind of experience was like a derealization being carried out by the person, where they removed themselves either very quickly or over a period of time from what we see as our standard reality. But of course, there are many people who've experienced this kind of thing right across the board, perfectly sane, normal people, whereas once this would have been associated with mental illness. Of course, now in the context of alien contact, we're viewing it very differently. And I think in the 80s, Jenny Randles certainly, and probably a lot of other researchers, including Bud Hopkins, John Mack, would have found that people were reluctant to talk about this aspect of their contact. They would try to keep it clinical and credible by giving the characteristics of whatever object they saw or whatever entity they may have seen. But what they experienced surrounding that and the other symptoms and things that happened to them, like bodily paralysis, etc., people kept quite quiet about that. And I think researchers had to really probe a little bit and ask the right questions and encourage people to get them to actually bring this material out. Of course, back in the day, we had a lot of people, and we still have skeptics and people who say, oh, they're suffering sleep paralysis or other kinds of psychological anomalies. But of course, in the light today of what we now know about relativity, quantum physics, and other forms of physics, we now know that this makes complete sense in the modern understanding of physics. So we're moving into another area where a lot of those experiences can be re-examined under a whole new banner and understanding.
Well, in some cases too, when and this I guess comes down to the investigator, is certainly a knowledge of the Oz factor, and to probe more deeply when they're interviewing witnesses. And sometimes, in some cases, I found that witnesses, actually a lot of cases, witnesses didn't even identify those sort of events as related to a UFO that they were actually seeing. So in their mind, they would separate out that information. So they wouldn't even tell you until you actually started to probe more deeply about their whole experience. And that happens a lot too in cases, even just in simple things like where people will ring up and say, I saw something, and then you say, did you see something? Have you ever seen anything else? You don't know until you ask those questions that will take them beyond that particular experience.
That's right, Cheryl. And of course, some of the symptoms experienced by people with the Oz factor, they have a huge crossover with post-traumatic stress or trauma, or the fight and flight characteristics that we exhibit as human beings when we're faced with something unusual, frightening, life-threatening, or unexpected or whatever. So there is this crossover that happens. But when you really start looking more deeply at the symptoms, you realise that they are quite specific to the event. And certainly Jenny Randles and some of the early researchers discovered that there was a zone around, seemed to be a zone around the target person or the person who was experiencing the contact or the sighting as a witness. And that could include traffic that would normally be travelling in the area suddenly not coming through. That people who would normally be walking around or in close proximity in the area would not be there, or they would not see anything. They would not recall anything. They would not even look in the direction that the person might be looking at. So we have this zone of disconnection around the person where, as you said before, they're in some kind of bubble, and that's created through consciousness and maybe even through implants, we don't know yet, that targets that person and somehow or other isolates them out from the reality and around them.
And groups of people too.
Yes.
I think the question around it is, like we seem to, researchers suggest, and I think it's probably true, that some UFOs phase in and out of this reality that we exist in, or have the ability to be in other dimensions in a very real sense, which our own scientists are starting to understand. And maybe some of that could explain why when they come through or bleed through into this reality, that either their proximity has an effect on someone who happens to be there, or it has a specific effect on that person, and this is the big question, isn't it? Why do some people have these experiences and others don't? Which I always hark back to, and is there still the unanswered question. So, but that Oz factor could also explain discrepancies in witnesses' descriptions, like time. Oh, it took this long. No, it was this long, or something like that. Or witnesses might see something, and someone will see something and say, "Did you see that?" And they say to the other witness or the other person, "No, I didn't. What are you talking about?" So maybe the Oz factor has far more of an impact in our on recorded and documented cases, which really hasn't been fully explored to the extent that it should be.
Absolutely, and I think there's probably a number of possible theories or ideas that come into play. And moving in and out of dimensions may certainly be one of them. Then again, it may simply be that a connection is made between the consciousness of the craft, if you want to put it that way, those on the craft, the collective consciousness on the craft or particular entities, with the target person or people. And so therefore it may be not so much on occasions that there's some kind of shift in and out of dimension, but it may be that there is this shift in consciousness and this direct link through this zone of influence around the person that is made by the occupants of the craft or whatever. And if we want to get into some of the symptoms that people experience, some people recall this kind of Oz factor in a very negative and frightening sense. It's been traumatic It may be associated with extremely loud noise that is so loud and invasive that it causes them to lose consciousness. And certainly I, over the years in my own experiences, have been subjected to a variety of sound mechanisms that are designed to do certain things to the person, putting you into a light altered state, a deeper altered state, a sleepy state, straight out of sleep, unconscious or whatever. So we have the use of sound being used very often in these events. And some people, if the communication or event has been positive, they will remember it as peaceful, serene. They will recall quiet sound. They will recall maybe buzzing or humming, and positive things in association with the event. They may also feel their body drumming or vibrating or whatever, but in their own consciousness they're quite okay with that. Other people hear really loud noise. It's invasive, it's frightening, it's traumatic, and the shaking or vibration of the body may be to them like a massive loss of control of their bodily function. And that in itself is traumatic, when you find that you can only move your head or your eyes and no other part of your body, that you can't do anything to wake up your husband, wife, partner, or anyone else in the vicinity. And then you have this sometimes passing out, or the memory stops at that point and restarts later on. So there are a lot of emotional factors that happen at the time of the event, and then after the event, when the person tries to assimilate it into their life and analyse and examine what happened to them and why they think it may have happened. And then, of course, you have some people who have no memory of what happened, and you have others who have good memory or partial memory of what took place next. And they can recall coming out of that Oz factor and they're in another place, like on a craft or back in their car or whatever. And that can be traumatic in itself, or it may be something that the person recalls having done before and feels okay about it, has some other deeper understanding of it that perhaps those who feel the experience is really traumatic don't have. So there are a lot of factors associated with the Oz factor that, as you said, need to be looked at. We need to really re-look at this in terms of the physics and consciousness that we are beginning to understand as a human race now.
I'm wondering, while you're speaking about, when someone has a shock experience that doesn't compute in their mind, it's not logical. Suddenly we're taken out of that logical frame of reference and put into an illogical one. Yep. Which, by the way, is what the effects of what a Zen koan is supposed to do, to prepare the student for information, to take them to a different place in their understanding. I'm wondering, I'm sort of tossing up as to whether this is like a side effect of advanced technology on the physiology of a human being, or is it created in a way that is like I guess you'd say, like people are zapped, so in a way that does that and is done on purpose though, and is to enable that person to be prepared for the experience, which they often sometimes aren't, or mentally prepared to take in information. Because I know with a lot of the hundreds of people that I've interviewed in that particular decade, that they said, I've got all this information in my head, but I can't get it out. I can't put it down on paper. It's like I know how the universe works, but I cannot describe it. I can't articulate it whatsoever. What about you?
Yes, I totally agree with that, and certainly I agree that in some respect this is a preparation. The Oz factor is a preparation. Often though, in the old days at least, it was a preparation for being taken on board a craft. And simply because there are so many, at that time there were so many hundreds, thousands of people worldwide being taken on craft at night for instruction and learning, or whatever it is that they're their sole task is in this life in association with working with these entities, shall we say, yes, it's a preparedness for being transported, because if you've got people in various states of wakefulness or awareness, and they're in a fear state or they're in a highly excited state or whatever, it's difficult to move people quickly. And so I have seen on craft, and I understand from experiencing it myself, that in many ways it's a simple way to move people around very quickly. And often when you get off the small craft onto a larger craft at the other end, you come to full awareness, you know why you're there, you know what's happening, you know what's going on around you. And very often at the end of the experience, and I describe this in my book, that people will then be put back sometimes into that altered state, for ease and quickness of transport, and it takes you into a state where you're not necessarily going to remember what took place that night. Because if you had millions of people worldwide recalling exactly what they are involved in during these sessions, you'd have a massive problem on the planet to be dealt with. So there is a matter of timing here and readiness, so that people are put into a lulled state. And I have memory of sitting on a seat waiting to be put onto a small craft to be transported home, and hearing a sound like a humming sound, which was very lulling. The atmosphere was quite warm, and you started to feel sleepy, and then it was easy just to be directed to do this, do that, get on this craft, whatever. You go back to bed, you're in a sleepy state, you don't remember what's taken place, and you fall asleep. So there's that reason, but also some people are just not meant to remember what is taking place. And you did mention another point, but it slipped my mind at the moment, so carry on.
That's okay. Well, I was just going to go into cases, because we've only got, trying to keep this short, these Zoomcasts shorter now. In that there was one case that always stuck in my mind, and I often talk about it, so some of the viewers may have heard me speak about it before, but it involved a woman who lived on the Gold Coast who rang me some years ago. And she had been on holidays with her daughter in the 1970s at a place called Lloret de Mar in Spain. And when she had been there, she had left her daughter and gone on a walk down to the promenade down near the waterfront. And as she often did, but this particular evening, as she got closer to that area, she noticed that there was no sound. That was the very first thing that she noticed. So this, then she kept on walking, and as she did, she could see everything in front of her was frozen in time. So people speaking had their mouths open, people cycling were on the bicycles and they were frozen. People even mid-step as they were walking had 1 foot raised, and they were frozen in time too. All vehicular traffic was frozen, absolutely everything, no sound. Which was very, very unexpected, as anyone who's walked along the coastline at sunset knows that, in a tourist area, it's quite noisy. So what happened was she had walked into a sort of shaded area, and as she looked on, she could see behind the scene over the river, because it was sort of like where the coastline was, and then there was an inlet where there was a river that went up there. And there was a bridge across that area, but hovering over the water next to the bridge, she could see a classic spacecraft, circular disc, and she could actually see 2 beings inside it. She had such a good view, and she was not that far away. And anyway, what happened was she then stepped out of the shadowed area that she was in, and as she did so, underneath the craft, it started to send sparks, and she described it as like a sparkler, and it just came out down in front of underneath the craft in front of her, and then it took off up where the water inlet was, And it wasn't until it got some distance up there, over the inlet, and disappeared, that absolutely everything switched back on again. So she got another fright where she, heard all the sound coming very quickly. All the vehicular traffic noise started, people talking, cyclists, all those sorts of things just switched back on as if someone had switched on a light switch. And she ran over to the nearest person and said, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" Now, they said no, they saw nothing. And apparently nobody knew what had occurred, that they had been frozen in time. So this is a good example of a woman, a witness who had seen that zone of influence or whatever from the external source, right, from outside of it. And the people within it apparently appeared to have no knowledge of that experience at all. Who knows what, well, she wouldn't have spoken to everyone in that area. But it was interesting that control was maintained seemingly by the occupants of this spacecraft until it was out of sight, so that nobody would actually see it in the local area.
Yes, that's a really good description, and it's very similar to an experience I had where I was at a barbecue way out in the country, and in the early 90s, and everyone was dancing and cooking sausages and loud music playing, and suddenly I saw a massive light just appear out of nowhere over a nearby hill, pointed it out to people, and at the moment I pointed it out, I noticed that nobody turned around to look at it. People had their backs to it except for me. And the next minute, exactly the same situation where everybody is dancing and they are like frozen statues, the music is pounding. I suddenly lose all memory of what happened next. And the next thing I know is that suddenly I'm aware of the loud music again. For a split second, I'm looking around at everyone frozen, and then everyone starts dancing again as if nothing happened. And my heart was pounding, wondering what was going on and what had happened in that time space in between. But people who come up close to not just craft and entities, but what you mentioned before about the silence. We had a group of hunters here in the Bay of Plenty where I live who came in close proximity to a craft which was initially seen as a large light. And they noticed that all the moorporks and birds in the bush stopped singing. There was complete silence, and there'd been a light rain, and in the area that they were in, as if they were under a dome, it stopped raining. But they could see the rain falling outside of a particular area that they were in, but it wasn't falling on them. A big circular area, there was no rain, and it was completely silent. So I believe that people are targeted. There may be situations where something is being transferred to a person, as you said, some information that they can't access until later in their life even, but they know it's there, they know it's arrived in their mind and their consciousness. And so we have these various reasons why these events happen, people being picked up, people being given information, people being examined, etc. But in terms of the sound that people are often aware of, which can sound quite spooky and like paranormal, we have to, and it seems to be for that targeted person and not those around them. And we have already developed some years ago our point and shoot technology, where a piece of technology can be pointed at a person in a crowd of thousands, and only that person will hear a sound, will hear sounds in their mind or their head or whatever, but no one else around them will. So are these craft and entities targeting our own energy signature? Are they targeting an implant that some people have? Are some people just random participants in something where the craft wants to do something in the area, but they don't want everyone to see it happening? There's a lot of unanswered questions, and I think that re-interviewing people who've experienced this, particularly back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, would be a great exercise to look at it in light of the information that we now have scientifically and in many other fields of science along with physics.
If only we had another life.
Yeah, yeah.
With a few clones.
Not enough time.
There's only so much time to do something, to do
Exactly,
things. Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
Yes, but I was just going to, just before we wind up, I was just going to briefly mention a case that happened here in my home a few months ago, where I had a group here that was meeting, and there were about 20 people here. I also run a monthly afterlife discussion group, as you know, and at that particular group meeting, two people. One of them was Barry Taylor, who was here, my colleague, and another lady. And the two of them reported that they had a moment where everything went quiet. There was no sound, no noise, nothing happened. None of us saw it. None of us experienced it. Barry asked a few different people about that. Had they noticed anything unusual? No. And I have to say, if it was just him who'd said that to me, I might have fobbed it off. But because there was a corroborating witness to his experience, the two of them experienced it at the same time while they were having a chat, where everything
That's very interesting.
Yes, where everything went silent. Yeah.
That's very interesting. And just briefly, back in the late 70s, I was travelling up a remote road late at night with my former husband. And we saw a whole valley lit up like daylight, so that you could see the trees. Everything was like daylight. And then we experienced the Oz factor, with the extremities of the body going numb, feeling slightly dizzy, sounds receding, the car stopped. I later found out through doing a regression that I was taken on board the craft. But the interesting thing is that I put a write-up of this on my website, and some years later I was approached by an elderly Māori lady who lived in the area, and she and her husband had been on the other side of the valley. They had also seen the valley light up, and they had also experienced the same Oz factor feelings associated with that encounter. But I don't recall them being there at all, or one of them being taken along with me. I have no recollection of that. But she described those same symptoms, which is very interesting. So we were on opposite sides of this long valley. So it's very good to have that corroborative evidence that Barry and the other lady had at that meeting, that something is happening and something that we don't yet understand adequately.
Yes, there's certainly more to investigate around this. And, even on a day-to-day basis, there could be things going on in our own lives that we're not even aware of. If an advanced civilization has this technology, if it is technological, to create these situations, then goodness knows what's going on to the human race that we have no clue about.
That's right. So there's the Oz factor.
That is. So anything in closing, Suzy?
No, not really. Just that, we have massive data on this worldwide. It's a fascinating aspect of the contact phenomenon, and it's very common in close encounters with craft and entities.
Okay. There you have it, folks. So thanks for joining us, and we'll be back soon with another topic for Strange Encounters Zoomcast.
And Merry Christmas, everyone.
Yes, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thanks, Sheryl.